Hey guys, so I'm back from the NAWCQ, and as usual I wanted to do a tier list of the best rogue decks using Dueling Book data from YGScope.com, as well as accounting for decks that top the NAWCQ. So you can always check my older videos to learn how the tier score is actually calculated, and I'll also link down some other valuable resources for keeping up with meta content. So before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as always, links and discount codes in the description below for Yu-Gi-Oh supplies. Now this was the meta tier list overall that I just did recently, and so basically for this current video, I'm just going to be looking at rogue decks only, so essentially anything in tier 1 and tier 2 that you see here will not be included, except for Sky Striker, because I do feel like that's actually still more so in the rogue category. Alright, so moving on to the tier list for this month for rogue decks, we're actually going to start with Mannadium, and this is definitely a deck that's been doing pretty well lately, and it actually had technically 3 tops at the NAWCQ, but one of them was like a Superheavy Samurai Mannadium I heard, so I sort of counted it as like 2.5 tops for the purpose of the tier score calculation. Regardless, it's a very strong synchro strategy, and at this point probably overtook, let's say something like Swordsoul as like the best synchro strategy of this format, although the downside is that this deck is rather kind of expensive, but nonetheless, being able to spit up a Roan is always nice. On top of that, this deck even has a counter trap kind of related to having a synchro monster, and then you have something like this Patter or Chaos Angel, which are quite new synchro monsters and provide kind of like interesting new kind of interruption in terms of board presence as well, so definitely one of the more popular options at the moment. And then we also have Tearlaments, which actually also topped the NAWCQ, and I've been saying for the last, couple months that this deck is actually still quite good. And now, of course, you have something like Kashtira or Flunder with, Shifter or any kind of banishing kind of effect. That makes it really hard for Tearlaments, but other than that, this deck is pretty solid. Like, for example, we have a lot of branded in the format right now, and I actually find Tearlaments to have a pretty good branded matchup. I mean, it plays Bestials, and on top of that, you could like try to super poly them away, but they're just going to come right back as well. So, that's how I view it at least. And then speaking of Swordsoul, we do still have them, and you know what, in terms of online play on Dueling Book, it's still quite popular, and I'm sure you see a lot of this at your locals, for example, as well, because it is actually quite budget friendly, and if you've seen any of my cost breakdowns of some of the top decks, this usually ends up being one of the more cost efficient ones, because it really is not too expensive to build anymore, and it's still solid. Obviously, it's definitely fallen down even in the last month or so. It's usually kind of like in the tier 2 area, but now I think it's kind of justifiable to call it rogue. But nonetheless, you definitely shouldn't overlook it or anything. I think it's still pretty solid. For example, in the very first weekend of the new format with this new ban list, Swordsoul won Toronto Regionals, so it's definitely not something you can sleep on, but definitely kind of being underlooked at the moment. And then we have Hero. I'm very happy to say this, and I'm sure most of you have heard that it did top the NAWCQ. Nathan, who had that amazing feature match, and I also did a deck profile with him on my channel. Super nice guy, and really showed that Hero, honestly, it can do well. And I always find, I'm sure a lot of you can relate, there's always like at least one guy at your locals probably that's just like dedicated his whole life to playing Hero. I know there's at least a couple where I am. So it's a really cool deck, being able to give Dark Angel to your opponent where they're basically their spells become useless is really strong right now, because let's say something like Branded, they just will die. Something like, let's say Runic, they're spell heavy, and even against Kashtira, it actually becomes a double whammy to them, just because not only do they now have a monster and they need that rebirth, but then you also have Dark Angel that negates spells, so it's still pretty crazy. So I think it's pretty good, and Dark Claw is always good in most formats as well. So moving up to B tier, we have Gold Pride / Punk, and this gets a little bit challenged to split apart. So what I mean by that is, okay, so first of all, there were 2 Gold Pride tops at the NAWCQ, but one of them was actually pure Gold Pride, and that's by Andrew, who's actually from Canada, so really cool to see that. But the other was Gold Pride Punk, and usually, if you see Punk nowadays, it's probably Gold Pride Punk, because I think that's the most competitively viable option. So the data from Dueling Book, at least, I'm actually relying purely on what's called Punk, just because that's I cannot identify Gold Pride at the moment. But you know what, it's still pretty solid. From what I talked with Andrew, who topped it with pure Gold Pride, is that in his view, pure version, it might be better in this format at least than having it with Punk, just because it can die to something like Shifter. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know too well about the Gold Pride part of the deck. Obviously the Punk strategy, it's always been known as like another synchro kind of package, but the Gold Pride stuff, I know it can draw and search quite a bit, and also it has some unique interactions with like the fusion baller guy that can essentially take your opponent's monsters and equip, so it's got some interesting presence, and really cool to see that a new archetype is able to do well. And then we have Sky Striker, which of course on Dueling Book at least, or in other online platforms, usually has a lot of play, but unfortunately generally has kind of a poor win percentage, just because you also have a lot of players that are not very good with the deck playing the deck, and this deck does require quite the high skill ceiling. And so unfortunately at the NAWCQ I did not have any tops, although in the Worlds playoffs I know there was at least one Sky Striker being played, although unfortunately I did not include that as part of this tier score calculation. And then we have Mathmech. So unfortunately it did not have a top at the NAWCQ, but if you know Yassine, who also of course makes YouTube videos, he was actually quite far, and I think he probably just kind of lost at the last bit and was not able to make top cut, but he was doing really well with Mathmech actually. So, and you know, it's definitely top regional so far as well in this new format, so it's definitely really good despite that limit of circular. And online, honestly, this deck always does well. 59% win percentage is actually pretty insane, so really impressive, so definitely don't sleep on it just yet. And then we also have Dark World, which is kind of surprising to me that it's still kind of this high. Although in the plus side, with Dune coming out very soon, I believe that's where they get their it's kind of like Searcher, and they can also discard for effect. So that's really strong for Dark World actually. And I believe it is a secret rare though, but who knows? Will it really be that expensive? I mean, this deck is not like tier 1 or anything, and it's definitely fallen off in terms of the hype since the structure that came out. And you know, while we're maybe not in the most like droll kind of format as we were like a month ago, I think the play of this deck has definitely fallen down quite a bit. And then we have, you know, Red Eyes, Dragoon, Turbo decks. Realistically, this only really sees, I guess, a lot of play online on Dueling Book at least. But in terms of IRL play, I don't think I've really seen a Dragoon Turbo deck top in quite some time. But you know what, there's like different variations. I mean, I'm not sure if this also includes Subterror, because YGScope can at least identify Subterror separately, but something like, let's say, like Necro Valley, Dragoon Turbo with Floodgates has always been kind of like a popular deck depending on the format. But win percentage wise, it does pretty well. Dragoon is actually pretty still good in this format, right? Something like Cashier, something like Labyrinth kind of struggles against Dragoon in a lot of cases, which is why Branded's still playing it for the most part. So definitely something to keep an eye out on. And then we have Marincess, which I guess, you know, this format, since this new ban list, it actually has not had that many regional tops as it had just the format prior to that, where it even had a couple YCS tops. I'm sure the potential is still there. I mean, you look at the win percentage, at least among those dedicated players, I'm sure, that are actually still running Marincess, they're doing really well with it. So I think if you know how to play it, you can probably do pretty well. You know, it does have some pretty unique presence. I mean, like that trap to be able to play from hand, like not only is it imperm, but protecting your own monsters, I think it's pretty insane. So I think it's a really fun deck. Moving on to the C tier, we have Traptrix. This is kind of similar to Marincess in a way that it lost a lot of popularity in the last few months now. But you know what? It has like at least a little bit of regional tops, not as much as it did in the past format, but still kind of there. And you know what? It's like the cheapest deck you can build that's actually competitively viable at the moment. So for a lot of you new players, this is probably the deck that you want to start out with, just so if you're too worried about investing too much upfront into the game. And then we have Exosister. You know, I think this would be actually way higher if I was able to, you know, for example, incorporate the World's Playoff tournament as part of the tier score, which I didn't. I only relied on the NAWCQ, and of course I'm saying that because Steven Santoli won his World's Playoff bracket with Exosister after winning the NA Remote YCS with the same deck. So I also did a deck profile with him that you can check out on my channel. This deck, you know, among online at least 57 win percentage, again, pretty insane, and it's actually seeing a lot of uptick now in terms of popularity online, which I'm guessing Steven has a lot to do with that, because previously it actually was not seeing that much play ever since, you know, tier limits essentially got destroyed on the ban list. And then we have Dinos. So we don't have that many tops actually, even at the regional level with this deck. I know Wild Survivors did release a couple new cards for them that they can actually use from a meta viable standpoint. But you know what? You have to give credit to Dinos. Like, this is one of the only decks from the years that I've been doing Rogue tier lists that's constantly still here, and that also includes Hero. No matter what, you know, however the format changes, however the game develops, I think people just love Dinos, and they're still trying to find a way to play with it, and it's always seeing at least some kind of play, which you can't really say for a lot of decks in this game. And then we have Superheavy Samurai, which is kind of weird to see as kind of like a rogue deck already, right? Just like a month ago, this was by far, you know, the tier 1 deck. But nowadays, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there was a top that was Mannadium Superheavy Samurai. I'm not quite sure what the exact deck breakdown was, but for the purpose of the tier score calculation, I just treated it as half a top from the NAWCQ. And so, you know what? I think it's really solid. The package is still pretty strong, and also, while you don't really have that one card combo as explosive as it was before with the Scarecrow ban, but at least I've seen it in being used as a package in other kind of rogue decks, right? Like something like Zephyra or even like Spiral. So I think that's really cool, and I think it's here to stay as kind of like a rogue deck package. And then we have Plunder Patrol, which I believe it actually has at least 3 regional tops in this new format post-ban list, which is honestly pretty impressive. Usually it goes with the runic side of things. Previously it was with like the adventure token package. I think the runic version, I'm assuming, is probably the most optimal way. Now of course you do have to consider that, you know, in the next ban list they're probably gonna hit runic cards again in some fashion. That semi-limit to a fountain wasn't really that big of a deal, and you know, being able to draw a lot is something that Konami doesn't usually like, so that's something to consider if you're kind of like considering to play this deck. Just know that the runic package is probably not safe, but hey, at least the adventure token side is still there, and this is still a really cool rogue deck to pilot. And then we have Salamangreat, which surprisingly had 58% win percentage the past week online on Dueling Book, but I'm going to assume that probably has a lot to do with just like the smaller sample size, because this deck, it used to be something that was always popular in play, even if it was not like a tier 1 deck. For example, like during the pandemic, it was still seeing a lot of play, but nowadays, honestly, even on Dueling Book, it does not see that much play. Unfortunately, has not had really many regional tops at all in the last few months. I'm sure there's some people at your locals that are really love salads, and despite the new support that's coming out, I heard it's not that very good. So unfortunately for you salad players, I guess you're just gonna have to wait a little bit longer, but I'm sure at least in the next ban list, Gazelle would probably come at least to 2, because I'm not quite sure how Engage came back to 2 before Gazelle did. And then next we have Tri-Brigade. Unfortunately, this is another deck that's just fallen a lot in terms of popularity in play in online or IRL events. 46% win percentage also is quite a bit of a dip as well, so it's not looking too good for Tri-Brigade. I'm assuming even now the Sprite version of it is probably the best version to play, despite the ban of Elf a while back. But you know what? I'm sure there's a lot of Tri-Brigade lovers out there that are going to try to make this deck work, but unfortunately at this moment it looks like it's not doing too well, and not really the best rogue option at the moment. And then we have at Ignister, and so I'm going to assume this is probably has a lot to do with someone like Vizion on Dueling Book, who's always rated very high with this deck. You know, the 59% win percentage is like really high and really insane. Again, I'm sure it's kind of based on a smaller sample size, but you know what? The NA Remote YCS a few weeks ago actually had, I believe, the finalist, or the second place deck was like Mathmech at Ignister, so you know what? Maybe something that we just can't really sleep on even now. They do make a tower kind of monster in terms of arrival at Ignister, which for a lot of decks it can be pretty hard to out, right? So I think it's really cool to see this still now. And finally, we have Dogmatica, and so I think this is actually kind of slept on, at least from the perspective of rogue decks, just because it's actually a solid anti-meta strategy, and I guess with the Mind Hacker being banned, this deck can probably rip the extra deck better than Kashtira can. And even as a package, Dogmatica, I think it's actually, its value has increased a little bit, just because you have a card like Duality that came out, and so now you can convert something like, let's say, a Maximus or Fleur-de-Lis into something like Dragoon, which, as I mentioned earlier, is pretty strong in this format, and something like Maximus, you know, you do see that being played in some branded lists. Personally, I think that's a little bit risky, just because in the mirror, or rather, even if you're playing against something like Kashtira or Labyrinth or Flunder, they all have cards that they can send from the extra deck and benefit. So I think Maximus line is kind of high risk right now, but at the same time, I think Fleur-de-Lis definitely see some play. If you watch that Day 2 Cyber Dragon deck profile by Savage Pete that I posted on my channel, he was actually playing Fleur-de-Lis as well, just to go into Dragoon with Duality, because Duality can be really good in Cyber Dragons for other purposes, right? So I think Dogmatica is very solid right now, and definitely I think probably a cheaper option from my understanding, so something to check out. And then finally, we have Dinomorphia. So this is a deck that I've definitely showcased on these tier lists the last couple of months or so. It actually did get some new support in, I believe, Cyberstorm Access. You know, they at least got like a counter trap, for example. And you know, this the way this deck works, that aside from a lot of the back row, it's kind of like main monster, kind of almost essentially becomes like a Mystic Mine in a way. And it usually sucks losing to this deck, because when you do lose, they probably only had something like 13 life points. So it's really hard to go out that way. But I think it's a really interesting strategy. But in terms of regional tops, I believe has at least one that's at least publicly known, and maybe there will be more, but as I've kind of said in these kind of videos, I think it's a little hard sometimes to bring a deck like Dinomorphia into a higher level event, just because of like the time rules, and you're always going to be lower in life. I think it can be a little bit hard to play, at least at like regional events, with this deck. So anyways, that was it for the Rogue tier list by the data for this month. Hopefully you found that useful, and hopefully it helps you in terms of choosing your next Rogue deck that you want to pilot. A big thanks to all of you for watching. A huge thanks to my Patreons. And also we have a new Patreon. Steve is not always broke. Really appreciate the support, and well, take care guys.